This is the University of Derby and University of Derby Online Learning Research Ethics Approval Processes and Procedures, and it's relevant to student and staff applications. The learning outcomes are understanding the process for approving student projects to taught programs, discuss some good practice in providing samples of applications from your students on a module or a program, and discussing some of the good practice in completing ethics application forms, and know how to contact the ethics committee and source documentation related to ethics applications. So, basically, we have an ethics committee, obviously, and this is part of the university structure. So each college would likely to have an ethics committee, and we have one in UDOL that covers certain staff applications and student applications. So basically, how important are ethics and why do we need an ethics committee? And this is for, even if it's a low-risk project, service evaluation projects, or audit projects, or desk-based projects, we do have ethics procedures that you have to do that. So this might be to ensure that there is integrity, good practice, rigour in your design. So justifying what you are doing and why, which is quite a useful process for students to go through anyway. It's not just about during, but after the project as well. So considering things like dissemination, integrity of results, thinking about, for example, the measles, mumps and rubella linked with autism that was published quite a few years ago now, but that just illustrates some of the considerations that you need to make with research conduct, but also in sharing results that are not ethically analysed, or they haven't been robustly analysed, or there are some discrepancies. You might need to think about environmental impact, intellectual property, copyright. Are you using data for the purposes for which it was intended, or for which it was the participants or the users may have consented for. So it's also thinking about what you might do with adverse events. So what if this happens? What will I do? Who can I refer to? Who can I get support from? And so therefore it's there to protect researchers and participants. And so you need to really consider quite thoroughly what you're going to do and why you're going to do it. I've put on there the Tuskegee syphilis trials as an example of why ethics is important. This was something that occurred during the 30s and 40s and went right through to the 1970s. And basically, the black slaves in the US were deliberately infected with syphilis, so that they could try and research the condition. But these people were not told that this was the case. So it's about making sure that your participants are well informed, or you have a very clear justification for what you're doing and why, and what the impact of that might be, not only on the participants but also researchers and the wider society. When you're coming to disseminate the results. MMR and the autism link is a good example of that. So, quick questions. Do you need to complete the ethical considerations section on the application template? And all of these are available on the SharePoint site, and I'll give you the link for that at the end. So basically, I'm conducting a low-risk study with focus groups of staff members where I work. Do I need to consider, are there ethical considerations that are required in this? And do I need to make sure that I fill in this section 6 of this form? So the answer to that is yes. Basically, there's a human element to this research, so full consideration of all of these things needs to be given. If it's not applicable, like for example animal rights, then you would write not applicable in that section. But you do need to consider all of these different things. The important thing is, although we're not here to always necessarily assess the methods that are being used, we need enough detail on your design and methods, on sampling, consent processes, data protection, confidentiality, withdrawal of consent, regardless of the assessed risk of the study, because otherwise we can't, if the information isn't there, then we can't determine whether there are ethical concerns or not. And it's also good practice for students and staff to have a very clear idea of what they're doing and why, and at what stage, so that there's more rigour and more consistency in the research, which is good research practice. So, next example is, I'm using consumer data collected from my business. So this might need to be surveyed, or it might be just data that we store as part of a business or within an organisation. So would you need to complete the ethical considerations section in the form? So are there ethical considerations if you're doing this? And the answer is yes again. Basically, you're using data from your business. We need to be very clear that how you're going to use that data. Is it going to be anonymous data? Is it not going to be anonymous data? And what is your justification for that? Was the original purpose for this data, was there consent to use it for the purpose that you want to use it for? And you need to provide some kind of evidence that that is the case. And that might be part of a condition of approval, or it might be something that you already do before you submit the ethics form. But there are still ethical considerations that you need to know, even with something that is probably low risk. But ultimately, we have to make sure that we are only approving things that have been well considered. So, this one, I'm conducting desk-based research, a secondary analysis of data that might already exist, and it had no human participants at this stage. So you may very well have had data from human participants in the first place, but actually you're just using data that you're finding on the internet or publicly accessible data or something to that effect. Do you need to complete the ethical considerations section? And the answer is yes. So yes, it might be minimal risk, and you might have done a risk assessment to that effect, which is also good practice if you would want to include that. But actually, if it may have included original participants, in which case have they consented for the data to be used in secondary analysis. You might also need to consider the ownership of the data. Is it public? Is it owned by your organisation? Is it owned by someone else? Is it on a platform that doesn't allow you to use data in this way? You need to think about these things and make a clear statement about it. It might be that what are these findings, what impact of these findings could have on your organisation, your business, or the wider locality. So, for example, we were conducting a secondary analysis of birth certificates and death certificates in the Gypsy traveller community, and one of the ethical considerations that came up is what impact could the findings of why Gypsy and travellers, what are the cause of death in the Gypsy and traveller population, what impact could that have on the actual population and the perception of society on that population. So it was low risk and it was publicly accessible data, but you have to think more widely than just what you're collecting and why you're collecting it. It's then the purpose of that and what you're doing with that data. So you still need to also consider data protection and make sure that you're adhering to the university and your organisational policy or any other approvals that you might need. So this might be, in the NHS, it might be research governance. In larger organisations, there'll be some kind of corporate values, mission. There'll be data protection policies in other organisations as well. It's not just reserved for certain areas. So you do need to consider this and be explicit about what you've considered and how you're going to prevent any impacts of that. Okay, so this is a flowchart, and this is available on the SharePoint site. It is an interactive document, so you can click on the blue links and it will take you to certain areas of the site. This basically talks you through how you get approval for projects, and this might be staff projects or it might be student projects. So the student flowchart is this side and the staff flowchart is this side. And this talks you through how to submit, where to submit, and what to do if you think that you need to get a chair's action or an expedited approval. And sometimes that might be because of consultancy work or something like that, but you have to be very clear on why you need a chair's action. And don't want to go through the usual processes. So there is a document that talks about that in our policies, and it tells you about what kind of situations will allow you to get a chair's action on a staff project. And staff projects include service evaluation, audit, and research. Anything that's collecting data in that way needs to go through the ethics committee. Okay, here you have the student flow chart. So the student will submit an ethical approval form on their appropriate template. So psychology has a very specific template, and then we have a generic one for the staff and students. The psychology has a risk assessment included with it, and that is actually good practice. So there's no reason why you can't include a risk assessment in the generic template as well. That helps justify why you think the project is low risk. Okay, so the student will submit the ethical approval form. If they are an undergraduate student, their supervisor will determine whether it's classed as a high-risk project or not. If it's not a high-risk project, then the supervisor is able to approve that to go ahead. If it's a doctoral student, postgraduate research student, then they have to go through the form procedure that the staff would go through, and this part of the form tells you about how to do that. If it's just a postgraduate or taught master's program, for example, then it will be reviewed with a second academic, so the supervisor and a second academic, preferably someone who is also on the ethics committee, and they will agree a decision. If they cannot agree a decision, then you can escalate that up to the committee. If they can agree a decision, then that will be considered approved, and then we will go through to the sampling process. So every module and program needs to provide a sample of student submissions. So this is for quality, governance and consistency. So your students will have already had their applications approved because that's the University of Derby procedure, and we are adhering to that. But you still have to provide a sample. So the dates of the ethics committee are listed on the SharePoint site, and you should aim to submit those well in advance of the committee, and there are suggested dates for that. You will have to submit 15% or a minimum of 10 student applications for review, and that will depend on whether you have a large number of students or a smaller number of students. You can either, now I know that different modules have the forms submitted in slightly different ways, so there are two options for submission. There's one where you can create a list of students to be sampled, and then you upload that list to the student applications area and make sure that I, as the chair, have access to that term thin area or the area of Blackboard where these have been submitted, so we can review them in the committee. The alternative is that you upload copies of samples, and you'll use this format of file name, and you will upload those to the student application area on SharePoint. So there's two options depending on whether you have students submit to return as in, or whichever suits your particular module. So one of these is likely to suit more than the other. Just make sure that we're aware of what that is when you submit either the document or a set of documents. So it's your preference. We'll then have the ethics committee, and we will provide overarching feedback to the module leader or the person who submitted those. And this is aimed at just making sure that we've got consistency across the University of Derby online learning, that we're adhering to University of Derby policy, but also to note any good practice recommendations or any changes that you might need to make in future to ensure that good practice is followed. So this is meant to be like a developmental process and just a monitoring to make sure that we're all doing things the way that we should be doing them. So, I'm going to ask a few questions and then provide you with some answers. So, who can approve undergraduate projects? So undergraduate projects can be approved by the supervisor and also a second academic as well as their concerns. Who can approve postgraduate taught projects? So this would be for master's programs or PG programs, for example. Okay, so this would be the supervisor and the second academic, preferably someone who is also on the committee as well. And there are identified people on the committee. The list of people on the committee can be found on the SharePoint site. So you should be able to identify someone who's appropriate to do that. So how many sample projects do I need to provide for my module? So the sampling procedure is detailed here, 15% or a minimum of 10, depending on how many students are on your module, and this area tells you how and the methods by which you can provide that sample. So, how do I submit my student samples? This area here tells you there's two options, and you can select one of those depending on your particular submission methods in your module. Just make sure that either a list or a set of samples are uploaded to the student samples for review area of the SharePoint website. And what format should file names take for if you're submitting a staff project for review? So this bit here, this tells you how to submit your ethical approval form as a staff member. That is a staff application area, and the reason being is because there is actually a virtual committee that happens for staff projects so that they can get approved within a reasonable time, and that we don't have to wait for each trimester to do that. So that's why that is there. Make sure that you do send an email to UDOL Ethics to tell us that that application needs review, so that we can make sure it gets put on the agenda for the next meeting, or so that we can upload it to the virtual space, so we can hold a virtual committee to agree it. So this is some guidance on good practice in sampling student submissions. So these are the options that have been detailed on the previous flowchart. This tells you the number. Ideally, anyone who's a new supervisor or a new staff member to UDOL, or someone who hasn't supervised for more than a year, we will want to see some sampling from those groups of people. You should make sure that you record the process you use to select your samples. There is a template suggested sampling procedure on the SharePoint page on the policies and procedures. So if you don't choose to use that for whatever reason, then you need to make sure that you have a rationale and a method of what you're using, because we can request that as a committee. And in order to report to the University Research Committee, we have to submit a report once yearly, and part of the sampling process needs to be reported in that. So that's the reason we get you to make sure that you record that. Okay. Make sure that you include any submissions that you consider to be medium or high risk or are involving vulnerable groups, just so that we're making sure that we are being consistent in those areas and we're not allowing things to do that we shouldn't be. And just to note that failing to submit the samples for your modules could prevent student progression. We have a policy on misconduct and research in the university, and not adhering to this policy, which is a university policy, will have a wider impact. So we do need to adhere to it. It's not something that we're forcing people to do in UDOL, it's something that is university-wide. Okay. One of the main things that I wanted to point out is what you do after you've received ethical approval. So ethical considerations do not end just because you've received ethical approval and you have that letter or you have that feedback. So I've given some ideas about what you might need to monitor, things you might need to report, and how to make minor or major amendments. So anything that you change as part of that study needs to be reported to the Ethics Committee. And if you're making major changes, this needs to be reviewed again and approved before you can actually go ahead with those changes. And so, therefore, it's important to understand what to do after receiving ethical approval. Okay, so this, again, is listed in the SharePoint area. And so you can have a look at this. You will, in your approval letters, be referred to this as well, just to make sure that everyone is aware and everybody knows what should be happening as good practice after you have approval. One of the main things that I would point out here is that you should make sure that the Ethics Committee is notified when your study ends, and if it's a staff project where you would expect some kind of summary abstract report or something to suggest what the findings were, or if you ceased the project, why that was the case, for example.
Recording started.
And you will sometimes receive conditions as part of an approval, and that might be that we want to further information or that you need to provide evidence of further approvals, organisational approvals that you haven't necessarily included. So that might be the case. Or you might have no conditions, in which case you just follow these procedures. Okay. In the SharePoint area, in the Policies and Processes page, we have a range of templates, good practice template, and all of our policies. So there will be a sampling procedure there. If you're adhering to that, then when you submit your samples, you should state that that's the procedure you're following. If you are not, just justify that and with a rationale, and then state how you can actually sample your documents. Consent forms is one of the things that comes up quite a lot. There is good practice in preparing a consent form for any research project, and so there will be templates available that you can use to copy and paste into, or use to whatever for whatever purpose it will be helpful for. But it would be nice to see some consistency in that to make sure that we are adhering to quality and governance processes. That's also true of participant information sheets, which should all include certain pieces of information standard, particularly if it comes through the committee. So make sure that you have a look at those and use the information that's in them. Adapt that slightly depending on your subject area or field, because obviously there will be slight differences. Sample completed application forms, so we will share some of those. Obviously different areas have slightly different standards, and you should be clear on your own professional standards and any professional guidance that's required as part of research in your field. However, this gives an indication of the level of detail that we require when you're talking about data protection, confidentiality, and other things like that. There will be some information on good practice in online and internet research. So university policy is quite limited, but we will share some resources on that, some good practice resources, so that will indicate the types of things we expect to see if you are doing that type of research. There will be, that's currently going to approval, some guidance for students and supervisors on agreeing who can publish data, who owns the data, and co-publications and things like that. Something around intellectual property and any shared commons. The research ethics and research misconduct policy is also there. So this is if students have conducted primary research without it actually being approved, or even staff having conducted primary research without that having been approved, which would happen, but you don't know. But yeah, that's something that could indicate what you should do in those circumstances. And there are also application form templates. So there's one for psychology, which has a risk assessment, slightly different things, and a generic one. It would be nice to see people conducting a risk assessment as part of their application. I think it's good practice for people to think about that. So we prefer that, but at the moment that's only mandatory for psychology. Okay, so where do you find all of this information? There's a lot of information to take in. But all of the policies, procedures, flowcharts are all on SharePoint, which can be accessed in the committee's pages. If you can't access this, then you need to let one of us know. Kira is our secretary for the Ethics Committee, and I am the chair. So if you can't access this, let us know as soon as possible, and we'll make sure that you can get on there, because you will need to submit things through here. You will need to access information through here. And if you're unsure about anything, asking us is the most important thing. We'd rather be asked than not have the information and then something go wrong. Okay. So we're happy for you to share any additional training needs. So you can use the UDOL Ethics at derby.ac.uk email. It is on the global address list. So if you feel that you want some more training on how to fill out the form, or confidentiality, or what kind of detail is required, then we're more than happy to support that. So please do let us know. The other thing is we always need a pool of reviewers to review staff applications. So if you're willing to be a reviewer, then please let us know. It's usually not more than maybe 1 or 2 reviews in a year, so it's not immensely time consuming. But it means that we have a pool of reviewers from different backgrounds, which is really important to staff projects. Okay, we're willing to answer any questions that you may have. If you've got any, just drop us an email, and we'll respond as quickly as we can. And just make sure that you're familiar with the procedures. Make sure that you submit your student sample, and we really just take ethics seriously. This isn't just about students. This is about staff. This is about making sure that we're working with integrity and leading by example for our students as well. It's easier to get it right now than justify why something wasn't done if something goes wrong. And it doesn't seem like something may go wrong, but I've had some very interesting circumstances where things just haven't necessarily been thought through, or just not having a particular logo on a document can raise questions that has to be then raised as an incident, even if it hasn't necessarily caused harm. So this is about our reputation as University of Derby and University of Derby Online, and research integrity. So take it seriously, and make sure you think everything through.